Hello and welcome back to Medical Compliance with Clarissa. I'm Clarissa Benfield, our Global Director and Business Line Leader for our Medical and Laboratory business at Intertech. And today I am so excited to be joined by Rachel Robinson from MassMEDIC. Hi, Rachel. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Yes, so excited to have you. Obviously, MassMEDIC is a group that we love being close to. So maybe to kick us off, you can tell us a little bit about yourself and then, of course, a little bit about MassMEDIC and the awesome organization that you guys are in the med industry.
Awesome. Happy to. And I'll keep it short and sweet for folks. So MassMEDIC is a almost 30-year-old trade association. We represent medical device companies in a variety of ways. But if you know a little bit about a trade association, you know it's a lot about advocacy. It's a lot about connections. And we have hundreds and hundreds of fantastic members, just like Intertech. So that's why we're thrilled to be doing this. But in my past lives, I worked for a number of product development and manufacturing companies. So this is why I'm exceptionally excited to talk about the topic today, and where I know just enough, I think, to be dangerous and have a lot of opinions. But I should say that all of my perspectives are just my perspectives based on the feedback we get from industry. But we're lucky enough at the organization to have a number of members who are in the space, both from a small company perspective as well as large company perspective. We talk to a number of investors. We have a number of acquirers as well as acquirees kind of in our membership base. So we get a lot of different thoughts and feedback from folks. So I'm excited to be able to share some of that and some of my thoughts today.
Yeah, absolutely, Rachel. And I think, your background, obviously, as an individual, plus this background that you have working with all of these exciting companies at MassMEDIC really brings an interesting perspective. So I'm excited to dig into some of the trends that we're seeing, some of the different things from an industry perspective, things that you're hearing. And of course, one of the things that we talk a lot about is compliance and the process of compliance and when someone should get started. And I know, from our side, we're seeing that people are starting to focus on compliance even earlier in the process than we've seen, in previous years. So, from your side, when you're looking at this or when you're talking to people, why are manufacturers either being required or focusing on compliance at this earlier stage?
So I think it's a really interesting one. I think we started to see a shift, in my perspective, around 2009, 2010. There are two ways to do compliance, right? Either you plan for it in the design phase or you retrofit after the fact. And there's a lot of commentary we could make about both ways. If the product is simple, maybe there's not that much of a difference in the process overall. But as your product grows and the regulatory requirements grow and the complications grow, it gets a little harder to do the retrofitting. Well, about 2009 is where we kind of started to see the shift in the market from acquisitions that were pre-market or just market approval of early stage med device companies. I mean, I can't tell you, it was like it shifted almost overnight from, great, we have a 510K, we're going to get acquired, we're going to go make some money, it's awesome. Well, I don't know how many companies got burned by that, but that is not the case anymore. In the last, 10 to 15 years, the burden on med device companies, early stage companies, excuse me, to go out, not just get regulatory approval, but to go out and have verified sales. And we're not talking about a small amount of sales, but if you want to get those multiples, big, high level sales, that has completely shifted the way people are looking at compliance. They're starting to think about it early on, which I personally, caveat, think is better. But it's just before things become too unwieldy, and an acquirer has to take on that burden, the risk has got to go away. And so that's kind of where we've been seeing it. But I'm sure no one in the industry would be surprised to hear me say that 2009, 2010 was when that switch flipped. Maybe a little earlier, maybe a little later, but it's been extreme.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear you say that because I remember right around that exact same time as well, going to a few different conferences and sitting in on some panels that were talking about M&A, that were talking about acquiring these small startups, talking about acquiring the technologies. And it was the exact same sentiment, which is gone are the days of this early acquisition. Now they expect you to be so much further along. And you could just hear it, right? Just the idea that it happened so quickly is completely true. And when you talk about, we've seen the advancements in the technology, plus the advanced regulatory requirements, plus the documentation requirements, the idea that you can do it on the back end and retrofit your compliance is very, very challenging to then go back and make sure that you are complying with the standards, complying with the regulatory requirements, getting all of your documentation together. It's not an impossible approach, but certainly, as you say, right, much easier if you start thinking about compliance during that design phase and that product planning phase.
And even if it's not about the acquisition, it's about the fundraising journey as well, because investors are getting more and more knowledgeable, especially in life sciences, about what the requirements are and what those risks are going to be. So even if you're not worried about your acquirer asking, you should be, but even if you're not there, having those certifications and having the your compliance in line is basically like a little tout that you can make during your investor pitch presentations to say, okay, we want you to give us money, and here's how we've gone and de-risked our process. Well, you know what? Those ISO certifications, the compliance pathway, putting together your own QMS system, like all of those things are part of the process that allows you to be more attractive to an investor when you're vying for money.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I don't know what your thoughts on this are as well, but I also think internally with some of these companies, we've seen that they've upped their game in terms of like quality control concerns or putting their own processes into place that really address compliance more in the front end and more as a, forward thinking process and really a full life cycle process.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just so interesting to like talk to folks after they've done their audits after a few years. The good audits are like, oh man, that was so great. The other one's like, some of the people you hear from, you're like, it didn't go very well. I'm like, well, let's look at your program. Like, what did you do that when you were setting this up that made it a little trickier? But I mean, you're just talking about too, and this is like kind of a little aside, but as companies are trying to hire and draw talent, those processes are something now that the employees are vetting them against. So like, wait, does your company have this process in place that I'm going to know directly how to follow to make sure that I'm doing not just the right work, but that the company is going to be successful?
Yeah.
So as everyone is getting more knowledgeable and a little bit smarter, the burden kind of goes up a little bit, but the opportunity to set yourself apart is there.
Yeah, and that's such a valid point too, right? Because obviously the medical and life sciences industry in general is pretty small, pretty niche, right? And we saw a lot of movement throughout the pandemic, either with companies having layoffs or people leaving of their own accord, moving, a lot of switching, right? So to your point, when you have new employees coming in, they want to know like you're following these processes and procedures that I'm used to working for a med lab manufacturer going through, and I know what's expected of me and what the product lifecycle process is going to be and where I fit into that process.
Absolutely. And, I think the only other thing that I would probably say, because this is kind of part of what we wanted to talk about too, is the other thing that we haven't even mentioned is economics. So let's just talk about the economics of doing this. So you've got the talent, you've got the risk, you've got the acquirers asking for it, you've got investors asking about this. But the economics of actually just running a company more smoothly because you have thought ahead. You've thought 5 steps ahead. And so instead of waiting to have to jump over the bridge, that is not there, you're building as you go. So economics just plays such a huge part in it.
Yeah, and I think that's, really interesting to mention. And so when you talk about, your past life, plus we were hearing from manufacturers, what do you see as some of this benefit from addressing compliance early on in this design phase? How is that improving the outcomes for manufacturers, and as well as, the time to market aspect of it as well?
So the time to market is huge because every piece of the ladder basically is a risk that you've got to check the box on. And I hate to say that because medical devices are so much more than that. Medical devices, at the end of the day, we all go into med tech because we want to save lives. We want to work on cool products that can change the way people live their lives longer, healthier, happier. So everyone's there for the mission. But you've got to actually get that product to market. So, I don't think it's any surprise to folks that the funding environment has been very, very tricky for early stage companies, especially in the last few years.
Yeah.
We're starting to see some glimmers of hope and some rebound there. But basically companies are competing for tech dollars. They're not just competing against medtech money. You're going out, you're competing against the wearables, you're competing against your widgets. You're going up and you're presenting your deck with 10 other companies that their time to market is 2 years and their time to profitability is 3 years. And you're going in with this idea that is, if we do everything right, maybe in 5 years we'll get our approval, then we'll get to market, but we probably won't get reimbursed for another 3 years. So don't worry, but we'll get there. It's
someday.
Yeah, we'll get there. And then you're going to make a lot of money, maybe. So the companies that are implementing this earlier are definitely moving faster to the market. But I do think it also it's just the risk. There is so much risk in a medical device product because it is a highly regulated industry. And because of what I just said, you're saving people's lives.
Yeah.
You're doing something that is a critical need, but also has critical importance. So the scrutiny is absolutely, it's validated, right? It should be there. You should have a high level bar to pass. But that means that it's going to take twice as long and you have to do twice as much. So it is speeding the journey and it's de-risking you along the way so that the things that you can't foresee, you got to plan for it, because your compliance is not just planning the things you know, it's planning for the things that you don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. That's just, you summed it up so well. And I think, even on our side, we see it so frequently, right? When people come in for testing or come in for their certification via the notified body, you can see a drastic difference between those people who have been preparing for a long time since the beginning, early engagement, really thinking about it throughout their whole design process, versus people who are like, hey, we have this really cool product. Oh, wait, no, we didn't consider all of these risk management file elements. Oh, no, our SOPs don't align with, our QMS. Well, it's sort of there, right? Versus those who have said, oh, yes, we've been following 14971 for our QMS since the beginning. We've thought about our risk management process since day one, right? You see the difference in terms of their overall experience and just the efficiencies, right, as well. And the headaches, truly, right, when you're going through and understanding on the front end versus trying to do it on the back end. You touched on something too that I just want to ask you a little bit about as well. We've seen this as well with the shift in this kind of evolving healthcare market with all of these new market entrants with technology manufacturers, right? Everyone wanting to capitalize and capture this market opportunity in the med space, digital health and AI. So it's interesting when you talk about those people coming forward with these really, really, exciting and shiny products, right? Oh, this
it's really a robot. It flashes. Look,
yes,
so
exactly.
Cool.
Right. Oh, I have this amazing app that does this, and this. All you have to do is wear this wearable, right? So they have all of these amazing things coming out where you have maybe some more established medical technologies that are incredibly powerful, but not as the, shiny, bright and new. So I think it's interesting when you talk about that, just this idea of we're all in the same space and everyone is competing for that level of funding and that level of excitement and exposure and, all of those things that, someone would need in order to get, the funding towards their product.
Yeah, it's really interesting too, because I think even additionally, like everything you just said, absolutely spot on. Like, we're not the sexy kids in the room necessarily anymore. And I think we should be, because, hey, life-saving products. But it's not as cool sometimes as the other opportunities, and it's not as quick to return. But the thing that I think, we could spend probably a whole podcast on, we don't need to, is you're also competing for that supply chain. I mean, I think if anything, COVID has shown us is that the supply chain is critical to the success and to obviously saving patient lives, but to the success of any company is you've got to have a well shored up supply chain. And if there are shortages, MedTech doesn't get the first dibs on things. If we're talking about chip shortages, they're going automotive, right? They're going, unless we make a very significant play and play cards that we've been holding in our deck for a little while, which we do. We try to make sure companies get priority. You're competing with that as well. So you've got to always be thinking about what your competitive advantage is. How are you preparing? How are you 5 steps ahead of the thing that might come? And all of these processes, but I completely agree with you too. You can tell the difference when someone comes in and they know their standards and they know what they're supposed to be doing, even if they're not yet sure how they're going to be compliant to them. They know the standards and the critical things that they have to meet. It makes a world of difference. I think the only other thing I would probably throw in on that is someone on your team has to be responsible for this. Even in a small team, and big guys are going to say, of course, we have a whole team of people who are doing that. Great. That's wonderful. But even if you're a small team, it has to be someone's job to understand. You need to work with partners who will help you meet those regulations and requirements. But somebody on your team needs to be responsible for understanding all of these things, because at the end of the day, the buck stops with the company and you can only count on other folks for so much. So you have to work in partnership and someone's got to be the one taking the lead internally.
Yeah, that's so critical. And I think making that, point of even with these smaller startups, even with these smaller manufacturers, right, someone has to really have that ownership over it to say, hey, you are responsible for this, and making sure that we're doing the right thing, because otherwise everyone knows you get pulled in a million different directions and you're focusing on this, focusing on that. and it, can quickly be like, I thought you were handling this, I thought you were handling that. And then, you quickly see issues. So I think that's a good kind of place to start too, right? Where we think about some of the common mistakes that people might be making when they're trying to go through this process or trying to incorporate compliance. So that's a huge one, right? Not having identified someone who is ultimately responsible, right? Are there other things that you see as, people making different mistakes that you've seen over your years in the industry?
So I guess the other one that comes to mind is, and I think it's getting better. I'll start with that. I do think it is getting better. We were just on site with one of our wonderful members today, and they were showing us their huddle rooms and everything. But it's the classic waterfall methodology, right? That companies followed for the longest time. Each step of the design process cascades over into the next, right? So requirements to design, to product, to testing, to deployment, and it all kind of flows downhill. Well, there's no one actually taking the learnings from each one of those phases and moving them back up the waterfall to say, okay, wait, we found this out in testing. We actually need to go back and make some edits here in real time. So you have to be able to capture the lessons and the learnings of each one of your phases of the process. And we all know the classic design process phases, but you have to be able to catch them. And you have to be able to incorporate them. So it's not just capturing those learnings, it's how do you incorporate it? How do you be nimble enough? And like I said, I think it's getting better. I do think companies have leaned more into understanding, again, what the role of a project manager is. And it's not just to control budgets and teams and put the Gantt chart together.
Yeah.
Right? That's not the only thing. And the role of kind of everybody in the phase owning that phase and knowing that it's their responsibility to utilize their skills and then use that information to make the product better overall. In medical devices, it's so complicated as it is, right? Like I can't tell you how many folks I start talking to and they're like, if I've known how hard it was to do a medical device, I may have considered something else. So it's really easy. Everybody should do it. It's not hard at all. We absolutely, everyone start a med tech company. But it's so complicated as it is. You want to make sure that every piece of your team that you've assembled and you've hired and you've trained, and because they're good, is able to kind of feed back into that loop. So I think that's a big one. And then the only other one I would say is, and it kind of plays into it, at the beginning of every project, you lay out the dream plan, right? You make the dream plan. This is how it's going to go. And it never goes that way.
Nope.
It's impossible to know all the things that are going to be thrown at you or anything that's going to go wrong, because it will go wrong. So being prepared for that, right? Understanding that your plan, and I maybe jokingly like refer to it as the birth plan, right? Like I have a birth plan. Okay, that's nice. But let's see what actually is going to happen when you get there. You need the plan, but you've got to be able to be flexible and go with the flow and understand how actually regulations are changing as well. Because you may start out on your journey that's a 2-year design process, being optimistic, 2 years all the way through design and development, you're going to get it to market. Well, what happens if the regulations change in year one? Or what happens if your compliance goals actually are different? What if there's new regulations and testing requirements that come into play? You have to just be able to be flexible with that.
I think that's such a good point, right? Because we see how regulations have evolved so quickly. And, we've seen more countries come online with having their own requirements, their own registration process, their own testing requirements, asking for specific things, asking for specific processes. And so if you started your design 2, 3, 5 years ago planning, or, oh yeah, we've gone through this process before, we did this 10 years ago, it's not the same landscape at all, right? I mean, you're dealing with completely different requirements, and you have to take that time to be following up. I also, the critical point of the feedback loop and making sure you're not just documenting when things happen, but you're actually incorporating that back in, because it's so easy when you're driving towards a deadline to say, okay, we just have to keep going. Yeah, we know that was an issue, or we know that was an error, but then doing, at the back end, making sure you're taking all of that back and saying, okay, the next time we go through this, it's going to be better because we know this, and this, we learned these things. Yeah. So important.
Yeah. And just feeding off that a little bit, it's important that it's someone's job on your team, not just to be policing whether people are following the requirements, but to make sure they understand why the requirements exist, right? I always felt so bad at groups for the person who was the QA person, right? The singular QA person who was just responsible for auditing people's notes and understanding making sure they're following the process. I'm like, that's such a thankless job. But moreover, the goal is that person needs to help folks understand why those requirements are in place. Why have we made the plan that we have? And why do these things exist? And what are they protecting against? And sure, there's going to be some that you're just like looking at, shrug your shoulders, say, okay, I don't really see why that's necessary, but it is a requirement, so I'm going to go do it. But for the most part, I think a lot of the requirements make a lot of sense. And planning for those, it's just helpful for people to understand, why are we doing this?
Well, yeah. And I mean, you said it at the beginning, right? It's all about risk. It's all about patient safety. And right, the reason we're all here, right? To make the world better, to help people have better access to healthcare, right? And so having the, QA fighting the good fight and really explaining to people, like, these are the reasons why these requirements are in place. These are the reason why these regulations exist. These are why we incorporate these as part of our plan, right? Why we do our due diligence even above and beyond in some cases, right? We see a lot of medical device manufacturers taking it even a step further than some of the requirements, right? Saying, we've done extra performance level evaluation, we've done extra usability studies, right? Really wanting to make sure our products are accessible to all, right? I mean, there's so many things that go into it, even just outside of this idea of meeting the regulations of a target market, but also then, what is our brand reputation? What are we trying to stand for? What is our, what do we stand behind, right? So you see that on top of just, this idea of making sure you're in compliance with the regulatory requirements.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think it's spot on.
When you're talking to manufacturers too, I mean, do you get the feedback or feeling that people think all of these compliance and regulatory requirements are stifling the need for innovation, or, because it's such like a catch-22, right?
When it depends on how bad a day it's been. Yeah,
right.
Sorry, to cut you off.
No. I mean, it's so true, right? Because you see people coming forward, like, I'm a doctor, I have this amazing idea, I want to develop this product, I see this need in the market, I see this need with my patients, that they come with this great idea, and then it's like, well, you can't do this, you can't do this. Oh, this has never been approved by the FDA, or oh, this is not going to get through, or oh, you didn't think about cybersecurity enough. Or, I mean, what is your general sense? I mean, even from your own personal opinions on innovation and our industry versus what the industry is saying when you're having conversations?
Okay, my personal opinion is that it both stifles and encourages at the same time. So it's kind of a vetting process, if I'm being honest. It's not just for small companies, but it's for any new product internally. You need to put that before any company goes and spends what it's going to cost to put a new product on the market. You really need to go and vet that out, not just the market, but the pathway to the market, right? So I think compliance actually does sometimes serve as a vetting mechanism early on to say, okay, we think this is a great idea. What is the actual process we're going to have to follow to get this through to market? How long is that going to take? How much risk is involved because something like this has never been approved? How much time? And so it does vet a little bit to say, okay, well, we're not going to make that investment because it's going to take X amount of dollars more than we want to spend. And it's going to take 10 years longer. Now, on the other hand, it does stifle innovation that way, because you look at it and say, okay, but what if this is the next great breakthrough that is going to change the face of medicine? And you just convinced that entrepreneur, that doctor not to do it, or even that big company, that the bottom line wouldn't be big enough. I mean, I think this is one of the things we've seen in pediatrics for a long, long time over the years, is there hasn't been innovation in pediatrics because the market has simply not been big enough to justify the expense and the risk, because the risk when working with children is 10 times higher.
Absolutely.
No offense to the adults, but we're a little bit expendable. Nobody wants the kids. You have to go through so much more. It's harder to get children in clinical trials. And so the risk, the timeline is so much longer, and the market is smaller. I do think that has changed in the last 3 or 4 years, which I'm thrilled to see. But for a long time, that was stifling innovation in pediatrics. So I think it can be both enabling and vetting, and also stifling at the same time. So it's trying to find the right mix, and understanding what are the requirements and what are the nice to haves, right? And I think that's a conversation, again, that could be a whole nother podcast about how do you really decide what your product has to have and the requirements that go around it, and what are those nice to haves that maybe are not going to be worth it.
Yeah, and I think it kind of harkens back to your point earlier of being realistic with yourselves as well, right? When you're doing a project planning process and understanding your timelines and planning for failure, right? And planning for delays, it also comes into planning for, globalization and where you want to go with the product and really being realistic. I mean, I can't tell you how many times we hear people that are like, oh, we want to take this product everywhere. And it's like, time out, you got to be realistic with yourself, right? Really everywhere, or are you thinking these, 3 or 4 strategic markets to start and then taking it to other markets, right? I think that's part of it as well. When people have these really grand ideas of, oh, we're going to go everywhere around the world with this amazing technology, but it's, taking it in that step-by-step approach and saying, okay, where can we get the biggest reach, the biggest ROI, and then take it out further.
Absolutely. And it's that feedback loop has got to be there, right? And at that point, it also needs to include the customer, right? Who your test market is as you're figuring it out, that you just iterate, but don't boil the ocean. So it's again a fine line. You can only iterate for so long. You will never have the perfect product, but what do you actually need to have, and how quickly can you get to it?
Yeah, I love to hear you say all of these things. And I think, overwhelmingly, it's all really positive, right? What we see happening in the industry, where we see the industry going. I think there's been a lot more alignment across the industry, right? Not only within organizations like yourself, bringing people together, but in some of the regulatory groups, like with IMDRF, right? We're seeing so much more of this unification of the medical device industry, that we're all trying to do the same thing, right? It's not us against them, or, everyone is trying to move towards the same goal. And so I think overwhelmingly everything that we're seeing is moving in a really positive direction. I mean, I guess depending on the day, as you say, and how people are feeling about, the
like,
MDR.
Is it a Monday? Is it a Friday? Are we one beer in? Are we
exactly right? Yeah. Where they are in their day. But I think, overwhelmingly, it's really exciting to see. So I think the last question I'll leave you with a little bit here is, what do you see as the future of compliance in the industry? Like, what do you think? Where do you think this is going? How do you think this is going to impact us going forward?
It's such a good question. And I think it's probably too big and out of my pay grade to answer. I think the things that I have seen that are very interesting are companies that and by that I mean more service providers, folks providing testing services that used to be very laser focused, right? We do testing. Well, now they're actually working with companies really well to help them understand their processes. They're offering software tools to say, okay, you are regulated in this country, and this country. Well, did you know that you can automatically see how the regulations in each country have changed in the last 24 hours or 48 hours? Yeah. So we're moving more to everything being electronic, and it's mostly there, I would say, for the most part, more towards automation, more towards taking those manual processes out of the hands of individuals that are can make mistakes. Yeah. And giving them, but it's using humans to their best ability. It's not replacing humans. It's using humans in the capacity that they should be used for. So I think we're seeing a big shift in that direction. It's going to continue to go. There's more and more software-only companies kind of popping up saying, hey, we've got this software to do this. Some of that will all shake out, right? There's a lot. But I think that's become those tools are going to make a world of difference for companies as they plan, as they track, as they test. And as they work with their partners, because no one can do all of this internally. It's a vital part of the ecosystem. You have to find the right partners that you can work with.
Yeah, and I think too, it's just amazing to see some of these, like even AI tools that are coming forward to remove some of these manual processes, some of these, overwhelmingly administrative tasks that people are having to do, right? And you take that out of it, which then allows for so much more time to be devoted to the actual meat of the development, or even on the flip side, right, with patients and doctors and actually using the products. By removing some of that burden, it's like, oh my gosh, how much more access to healthcare do people have? How much more time do they have with a doctor if you're able to use some of these tools to make it an easier process to use a device or to use the system? It's going to make such a huge difference over how people receive care going forward.
Oh my God. Next podcast, that is what we need to talk about.
Okay, I love it. Yes.
I could get on a very large soapbox on that one for a while around automation and technology in hospitals. I could totally do it. Yes. So next time.
So good. Well, Rachel, it was so wonderful to chat with you. Maybe before we go, you can tell everybody a little bit more about MassMEDIC, where they can find you guys. As I said at the beginning, we love partnering with you guys and spending time with your organization. So it would be great to tell people, what you have coming up and where they might be able to connect with you.
Absolutely. So we love to chat. Our website is www.massmedic.com. come and check us out. We host probably, one in-person event in and around Massachusetts every month, and our virtual programs, which are all free, are at least 2 to 3 times a month. So just check out the website. We have an upcoming list of events, and we'd love to talk to you about what's most important, right? So we have a great membership community, but the only way that we get to actually have any input on stuff like this is if we hear from people what's interesting and what's exciting and what we need to be talking about to our regulators.
Yeah, absolutely. So everybody go check out MassMEDIC. If you want to get in touch with Rachel directly, you can contact me. I'm happy to make introductions. And if there's any questions on anything we talked about, please feel free to reach out. Thanks so much, Rachel.
Thank you.